Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Two Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and I'm back here with Fowler. Say hello.
Good to be here.
And today we're here to talk about Conspiracy. This was actually Fowler's pick, and we actually didn't go through the random generator this week, so this is kind of his pet project and something he really wants to talk about. I'll just let you go ahead and start with the summary here before we get started here.
Yeah, I'll say that one of the reasons that I really wanted to watch this film like immediately, because I saw this sort of by myself, was recently. I think it's a very interesting film. It's like a bottle film. It all basically happens in one boardroom, and I think there's a lot of like nuance and subtlety to it. There's a lot of interesting psychological dialogue factors that I found very interesting, and I kind of wanted to discuss it while I was still fresh. But anyways, Conspiracy is really it's a horror film. It's a historical horror film. It's a dramatic reenactment of the Wannsee Conference, which was the policy meeting of a bunch of senior Nazi officials by the SS. In order to get basically support and collaboration between all the different parts of the Nazi government in orchestrating the Holocaust. There are four key Nazis in the film. There's Heydrich, who is the conference leader, the second in command of the SS. There's Eichmann, Heydrich's deputy on Jewish affairs, and kind of his second in command. There's Stuckart, who is a government official and lawyer, who wrote the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws that basically made Jews second-class citizens. And then there's Kitzinger, who's another like government official. And throughout the film, Stuckart and Kitzinger are the two most prominent opponents of Heydrich's proposal for the genocide of European Jews. At the beginning of the film, most of the officials are really ignorant of the full extent of the Holocaust. In fact, the SS has already secretly begun the Holocaust without informing them. But they quickly understand, and the audience does, as Heydrich and Eichmann outline how the Nazi government will define Jewishness, the means that they're going to use to exterminate them and where it is going to happen, and then also how they're going to destroy the bodies and all the evidence. And as the meeting continues, something the officials also learn is that, it's pitched to them initially as a policy discussion, but there is no real discussion. It's just a meeting in which the SS are running the show. They're deciding all of the things that are going to happen, and they're just being forced into it. And basically, over time, all of the Nazi officials who, disagree or have opposition to the plan, they are just slowly, one by one, coerced into kind of backing the Holocaust. And kind of at the end of the film, each official is forced one by one to basically give explicit support of the Holocaust as a plan and subordinate themselves under Heydrich and the SS.
Yeah, and it was one of those films that I think, a lot of times I'm not usually into biopics or historical sort of pieces, but I think I am coming around more to, because we had a discussion about it before we recorded, and I am coming around more to the fact that I think a lot of times when I think of historical films, I think of them not as a genre piece, but as like the genre being a historical film, right? So, you talking about it being a horror film is actually quite interesting to me, because it is a horror film in its own right. And I think when we talked about specifically tension building and things of that nature, I think this film does a lot of that. But to go,
I think outside of the historical element, how I would define Conspiracy is I think it's one of the most effective horror films ever, especially if you consider the fact there's not any overt violence or death. And I also think it's an exceptional, what is it called, a bottle film? where
Yeah.
everything happens.
So
I think
yeah,
it's an exceptional bottle film where like there's really not a lot of set changes and everyone's just really talking. But I
yeah.
think in spite of that, like there's a lot of factors about it that make it like incredibly effective.
Yeah, so for those not as familiar with like film sort of terminology and stuff like that, a bottle film or a bottle episode, if it's a TV show, is just essentially a episode or movie where it primarily takes place in one location and it's more character driven, right? So it's not like like there's a plot, but it's more so about exploring the characters in a specific circumstance. So like
Mm.
one I think about is like The Hateful Eight, for example, is a bottle film in itself. Where
Tarantino's best film, in my opinion, too.
yeah, but
But I'm also an enormous fan of bottle films. Like I love character development. I love the interplay between characters, and I think good bottle films have a level of sort of intimacy and depth that's really hard to do when you have all these changing sets and scenery and all these moving parts. But
yeah,
obviously, if you fuck up the bottle film, if you don't maintain that tension, if you don't have good characters, they're dreadfully awful. There's nothing worse than a bad bottle film besides a bad comedy.
yeah, I that's very true. I've seen like I haven't seen a lot of terrible bottle films, but they're like it's hard to like think of them off the top of my head because like I think after a certain point, if I'm not invested in like that type of like very close knit sort of thing, it's like a 20-minute watch and then I'm out. Like I can't finish it. You know what I mean? But
Mm-hmm.
I feel like let's dive into like sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly here, though, right? Like of what we're really gonna hit on. And I think the main thing,
Let's do. I know we ordered it differently.
sure,
Do you want to do acting, the acting and the actors first? Because then we'll talk about the characters and then a lot of the other technical details. I
can
think it'll
kind
be easier to build
yeah,
if we kind of define them first.
we can hit on that. Sure, yeah. So I think let's talk about the acting first. So we didn't mention specifically the actors who played in the summary, but Heinrich was played by Kenneth Branagh, or I'm sorry, what was the last name? It was
Bronick?
Branagh. Branagh, yeah. Then Stanley Tucci played Eichmann. Colin Firth played Stuckart, and then David Thurfell, I think is how you pronounce that, played Kurtz Kinser. As you
Kitzinger, yeah.
as you can tell, I'm terrible with pronouncing any sort of name, so sorry in advance for absolutely butchering these. But
Well, if you're ever going to mispronounce and insult the dead, I mean, I feel like the top Nazis that planned the Holocaust are probably
that's
the best bet.
yeah, that's also fair. Like I can very much spit in those fuckers' face for sure. Uh, but no, but they all did a fantastic job here. I want to start with Heinrich's performance, and then do you just want to move down Eichmann and then Stuckart? That kind of work that way.
Yeah, and Kitzinger in that last, yeah.
Sure.
I think. Do you mind if I start?
Yeah, go for it.
So Brian and I both agree that the acting is really good. I think all four of the actors we're picking out like masterful. I
Yeah.
think this is Kenneth Branagh's like best role.
Mm.
I think this is one of Colin Firth's best roles.
Which is
But
wild because they've had such like historically good careers.
yeah, especially Branagh. He's a fucking chameleon.
Yeah.
But I think Brian and I were most struck by actually different members of the main cast. He
Yeah.
really liked Stuckart as a character, and I thought Heydrich was the more interesting one. But anyways, Heydrich is terrifying. I think he is one of the most realistic and also scary representations of like a high functioning psychopath I've ever seen in media. Heydrich never kills anyone. He never beats anyone up.
Which
And he's actually fairly charming compared to the other Nazis, but he's incredibly unnerving.
as like a actually a little side note, like you find it more like unnerving than like a say what's it from No Country for Old Men, Anton Chigurh. You find it more like unsettling as a character?
I think so because Shigur and I would say the Joker in The Dark Knight, like they're scary, but they're not very human. Like they're very much like walking themes and symbolism,
Okay.
and they don't sound and feel like real people. I think the thing that's so creepy about Hydrick as a character is that he's real. You can meet people like that in real life, and they exist. And I think there's a subtlety to Hydrick as a character too. Like Hydrick, even though the film is quite dark and he's obviously a monster, he's quite cultured. He's obviously, very charming. He's actually pretty funny. He's always polite in kind of this weird, disconnected way. Hydrick will threaten to like murder or torture members of different Nazi officials who aren't going along with the plan, like in private. But then after they bend to his will, he goes back to being charming. He goes back to being likable. He goes back to like telling them anecdotes about himself and asking them for their stories. He's just so unmoored from reality. But there's this superficial charm to him, and I think this is interesting compared to other characters like Eichmann. Eichmann is like a brown nose and kiss ass to his boss Hydrick. He's an enormous piece of shit to like the servants and the guards and the Nazis at the convention that he views as basically being weaker than him. But Hydrick is consistently the most like amiable member of the convention. And I think the other thing about Hydrick, which ties to this, is his obvious intelligence and self-awareness. There are other Nazi officials, Eichmann is one, there's a couple others, where they're unable to hide their sadism and their racism and kind of how fundamentally evil they are. They're not self-aware of how they present, and they can't really come off differently. And Hydrick is very different. And we see this especially when he has one-on-one conversations with different officials, when he's trying to convince them to work with him. And he code switches. He talks to kind of an SS grunt and frames himself as just a soldier following orders. And, he doesn't like the legal bullshit. It's just about doing what needs to be done. And, he's got to wash his hands afterwards, but he's got to shake these fucking politicians' hands to achieve his goals. And then with the more educated political class officials, he's the opposite. He's a fellow bureaucrat who's very concerned with getting the details right and the technical components of genocide. And, he is doors open. And then with others, he's a fanatic, and he shares their disgust of those who are in the convention who are not committed to the Nazi cause. And I think the most powerful example of Hydrick's self-awareness and intelligence is there's a part at the end of the film where Kitzinger, after he kind of bends the knee to Hydrick and agrees to the Holocaust, he tells Hydrick this anecdote, which is clearly a warning about this little boy whose father is vicious and abusive and his mother is deeply loving. And then, as the boy grows up, the mother dies. He doesn't feel anything about the mother dying. When the father dies, he's besides himself and inconsolable. And the other SS officers who hear Kitzinger's story, they don't understand it. They don't understand the point. But Hydrick immediately understands the point. The point is that the boy's life is filled with hate. His obsession with and hatred of his father meant that he could not love the mother and he could not enjoy his life. And then when the father dies, he's lost. The only thing that matters to him is gone. And it's clearly an allegory for the Holocaust and also Nazi Germany's like hate-based ideology. And I think it's really fucking scary that like out of all the SS officers, like they don't understand. They're so hate-filled and ignorant that it doesn't compute. Hydrick is fully aware of the metaphor. He's fully aware of the reality and truth of it. He just it's irrelevant to him. And I think that's really scary. And then I guess lastly, Hydrick's underlying sociopathy, I think, is very subtle, and it becomes increasingly overt as sort of the meeting progresses. But, initially he kind of shuts down argument or discussion, and he does so under kind of the veneer of procedure or sort of politeness or, these other conventions. And then as time passes, you see his real nature, especially when he's threatening um, different Nazi officials in private and just breaking them. And then, you know, later in the film where it becomes more overt, he uses like public humiliation within the conference to um, kind of break other people in public. There's a part where they're talking about the gas chambers, and he forces one of the more obviously disgusted Nazi officials to eat, despite the fact that they want to vomit. There's another section where he forces some of the Nazis who are kind of fighting back to publicly apologize to him, which is clearly this means that he's using to sort of make them submissive.
It's
But
fucked up
he
power
frames
moves.
it under the politeness, and then I guess at the end of the film, when all the Nazi officials, he forces them one by one to support the plan and be subservient to him. Like that's the ultimate display of his dominance and power, But it's done subtly over time.
Yeah.
um
It's
yeah.
it's like all these little fucked up power moves, like I was saying. Like it's really a thing of like him constantly like playing these little chess matches. And I think what
Mhm.
really sells it too is like the acting with it, right? Like what Kenneth Branagh does a lot is he'll have these moments where like people are either saying like really fucking stupid shit in the course of the meeting, right? Or they're saying shit that's like directly opposing to his position on the matter as it relates to the Holocaust. And
Mhm.
you can see in his face like the seething contempt, right? Like
Mhm.
in his eyes, like he has that sort of thing where his jaw is like tightening every time they speak up or interrupt him. And um, he always another thing I really liked is like anytime there's these interruptions, he always brings the conversation back to himself in order to
Yeah.
like assert his dominance in that room, right? Like it's a very interesting thing to like, and that's something that's so interesting about like the little moments of dialogue in this. It's like um, there's these little tiny details that are like sort of the non-verbal cues to that whole mess there. And
Yeah, the character development in this is very subtle,
mm,
and it's very I know there's a lot of little details to it that I think really make it resonate and stick. And I would say also to your point, like I think the other really scary thing about Heydrich is that like it's very clear that most of the Nazis, even by the end of the meeting, they don't understand what a monster he is. And they
yeah,
don't understand how psychopathic he is and how
yeah,
manipulative he is and how vicious he is. And throughout the movie, when he has those one on one meetings or in those sort of moments where he's publicly humiliating specific Nazis, most of the Nazis never know. But the ones that do, they're always shocked and scared. Like even they who know his reputation and how powerful he is and how he got there, even they are like shocked by the level of like the underlying just viciousness and ugliness to his character. And I find that really, I thought that added a lot of tension to him as a character, and I thought it made him incredibly intimidating. I think Heydrich is, it's not just that he himself is like so real and so vicious, it's that like I thought they did a really good job of having the other characters react to his viciousness in an incredibly organic and like powerful way, if that makes sense.
yeah. And I think that's like probably the character where will that has like the most to say, like definitely like
Mm.
the forefront of the film. But I will say with like Eichmann and Stanley Tucci's character, there's a lot of things to like there too. Um, I think that with that performance in particular, what I really like is the thing we talked about with that shifting change, right? Like the honestly the politeness and the sort of two-faced sort of act he's doing throughout the film, right? Uh, you
Mhm.
know, uh, whenever they're the servers are like serving dinner or shit like that, he's fucking a complete asshole. There are specific soldiers who are in charge of driving the SS officers out of like the compound after the meeting. And at the end, they get like into the snowball fight and just fucking around. And he pulls one of them aside and just slaps the shit out of him and literally reprimands him for his actions, right?
Mm.
And it's one of these things that I really enjoyed how it showcases that kind of character, like what he's really about. Because at the end of the day, he's just trying to ass kiss and be a part of something bigger than himself, right?
I totally agree. I think Eichmann is an interesting contrast to Heydrich because um, Eichmann is kind of awkward and he's kind of introverted,
Mm-hmm.
and he himself is not a particularly confident or charismatic figure. And so, like, Heydrich can, to some degree, deceive the audience, especially at the beginning of like how evil he is.
Yeah.
But Eichmann is not like socially adept enough to do that, and so he I think he provides a very interesting contrast to Heydrich, as a character.
Yeah, and it's like it's nice to see that like all these characters aren't like one note, you know? Like
Mm-hmm.
they they're evil. They're all fucking evil, abhorrent pieces of shit, right? Across the board. But
Yeah.
they're all evil in their own fucking weird ways, right? Like, and that's kind of what leads to like Stuttgart as well. Like Stuttgart, like anti-Semitic, clearly, but
I would argue he's the most anti-Semitic character in this entire film.
really interesting. Elaborate on that, because I'm curious why your thoughts are there on that.
So I think one of the big um, underlying ideas, I guess, of this film is um, the gradients of how evil perceives itself,
Mm-hmm.
and how some of the Nazi officials are they're just unabashedly evil in an upfront sense, like Eichmann is. But I think Stuttgart and Heydrich are more adept at sort of being perceived in a more reasonable way.
Mm-hmm.
Stuttgart is, he frames himself as like a lawyer and an intellectual and kind of an educated man. And initially, he's one of the key people who opposes the plan, as we will learn later, not for moral reasons, but he's eloquent. He has a large vocabulary, and the way that he talks about the genocide is kind of very legal and logistical. And I think he's framed kind of in the earlier part of the film as being one of the kind of the more objective figures. But then there's a part kind of near the middle of the film where he's being accused of being, disloyal to Germany and not being actually on board with the anti-Semitism of the government. And he launches into this completely unhinged, hateful rant about how, like, actually he's the one who understands the true evil of the Jews, and that, like, other people perceive them as pigs or animals, but he understands their inherently sadistic, cunning, manipulative kind of like nature. And
Yeah,
you kind of see in that moment that, like, the veneer that he puts on that separates him from the other Nazi officials is not real.
and he's
He is just as evil and hateful and monstrous as them. It's just that his education allows him to put this kind of front on. You know what I mean?
yeah, and it's very interesting too, because being the most anti-Semitic character, you would feel that a character like that would be way more on board with like committing a mass genocide like that, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think what I got from that whole perspective is that um, it's weird because like I don't, like you said, I don't think it's a moral thing. I think it's like a rule of law thing, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there has to be like, in his mind at least, I think there has to be these proceedings and ways of going about things to subjugate the Jewish populace, but not to outright kill them, right? Because I think he views it as like not within the means of the law anymore at that point.
Yeah, yeah. His problem is that he thinks that they can do the genocide through the legal framework of German law. He doesn't, and through the legal system. He doesn't believe in kind of this strange extra legal, extrajudicial means of achieving his goals. And I think that's another kind of example of that veneer of being different when he's not, where he doesn't actually have a problem with exterminating all the European Jews. For him, it's a question of how and through what means.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see that sort of dichotomy because it's still like that evil sort of uh shit like that we're seeing throughout this film, but it's it's a different sort of uh, evilness to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also what leads us into Kinzer or King. God,
Kitzinger.
yeah, thank you. Um, because it's a similar objection, right? If I'm not mistaken, it's similarly on the legal grounds that he is not comfortable with doing this.
Yeah, Kitzinger. Stuttgart's problem is that it's legally untenable.
Yeah.
I think Kitzinger's problem is that um, he doesn't think the genocide is necessarily necessary. Like he thinks that just making the Jewish people second class citizens, trapping them in ghettos, stealing all of their wealth, sterilizing them, he thinks that that's enough to basically subjugate them, and he doesn't believe the Holocaust is necessary, and he thinks it's a waste of resources. But just like Stuttgart, like he it's not a moral thing. And as the film continues, you increasingly realize that he is also completely evil. It's just that Stuttgart presents himself as a legal expert. Um, Kitzinger presents himself as sort of like a public official who has
Yeah.
certain responsibilities to the greater wealth and sort of prosperity of Germany. But he is, that's just a veneer to cover up his actual seething hatred.
Yeah, and I think like by looking at all these, like, because these are the main four, because it's a pretty ensemble cast, but these are kind of the main four players at play throughout the film.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's one of those films where I actually think that like, for historical purposes, you need the full ensemble, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if everyone was necessarily pulling their weight. Granted, like you can only do so much since the recording of the lines is what it is, like for the historical purpose of it. But
Yeah.
it's one of those ones where like so many people like you have so many great actors in it that when they have those moments they shine, but everyone else in proxy are kind of like just there. You know what I mean?
Well, we'll talk about this later in terms of the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the massive amount of extras who don't really have a lot of lines,
Yeah.
I think that they also, it's not just that many people were at the meeting. I think it also shows the apathy of the Nazi government. There are figures in the Nazi government like Stuttgart who are like genuinely hateful fanatics.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the Nazis at this meeting, um, they don't really give a shit. It's just a meeting to them.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of scenes where they're like, obsessing about like how good the food is or how fine the French wine is. There's one scene where there's one guy who's like openly lusting after one of the waitresses instead of like paying attention to. I think that's the part where they're talking about building the gas chambers.
Yeah.
So I think their place in the film is it wasn't just hate that allowed the Nazis to rise to power. It was also like apathy
Yeah.
and stupidity by a lot of other people who just allowed it to happen.
Yeah, and there was even one scene where a dude was just drawing pictures, like just in the middle of the fucking meeting. So,
Yeah, yeah.
like, yeah, it does showcase those points of like what's going on there. I think, like, from a technical perspective, though, like if we're getting into that now,
Mm-hmm.
what really like with the dialogue and what's going on there, we've hit on a couple points where we've talked about like the subtle things, the body language, what we like. What is it that strikes you about this? Because this is your film you recommended, so I'm just curious like why you thought like or what you thought that really stuck with you from the technical perspective.
Well, I think the film does a really good job of. There's really three types of dialogue in this film,
Mm,
and I think they're very good at mixing together in an organic sense. And I think they're very good at like building that sense of horror that I think this film excels at. Obviously, the first part is like mainly Eichmann describing the gas chambers and the camps and the process, which is obviously dark and ugly. But I think the more interesting thing from kind of an artistic perspective is there's two other elements of the dialogue beyond like the descriptions of the Holocaust itself.
Mm.
One is the business element of it. I mean,
Yeah.
they kind of small talk, they network amongst each other. Throughout the early part and middle part of the film, they're constantly toasting to each other's accomplishments. There's a lot of kiss assing. Every element of the Holocaust, they negotiate about it, and they attempt to create compromises. And there's this emphasis on like, here is the stats, here is the papers, here is the population numbers, and there's a lot of sort of camera work in the film about like the cleaning up and the setting up and like doing all the detail stuff. And I thought that was very interesting because it shows how the Holocaust to them is business. It's not really, they're treating it as you would treat any other like professional conference you attend, and sort of trying to self promote themselves and trying to sort of position themselves to achieve their goals. And then I would say the third strain of dialogue that I think is very interesting is like we were talking about, like the apathy, like in between the conversations about planning the Holocaust. People are constantly joking and laughing. There's discussions of like aviation, artwork, architecture, music, property, nature. A bunch of officials tell anecdotes about their lives, about their childhoods, about their future dreams. There's a section where Heydrich is talking about how much he likes the building that they're doing the conference in and how he really enjoys the property line and the water line, and he wants to have it after the war is over. And like we were talking about earlier, like a bunch of the officials caring more about wine and food and hot women than their jobs.
Yeah.
And I thought that also created an incredibly disconcerting kind of environment in this film where it's professional and routine in some ways, and it's also, in that sense, it's very human. They're not really portrayed as these automatons. They have lusts, they have greeds, they're gluttonous, and they're fundamentally very human. And I think that that contrast to what they're planning is very uncomfortable, and I think it adds a lot to the film.
Yeah, I think the audience really has to sit with that, right? That these are actual people who had actual ideas, goals, ways of living, sometimes not like on the scale of like being a Nazi, very different to us, obviously, but like on some scales, not really. I mean, like there are some people who had like dogs, some people who had like families outside of it, and goals within those things. And I think for an audience member to like look at that and be like thinking about like just their relation to just having those lives outside of like other shit they do is kind of wild, especially to think about with like the ultimate evil, which is the Nazi Party, right? But I think there's like and a lot of times there's this, and we talked about it a little bit here, but there was always this emotional shift and this building of suspense that happened throughout this film, right? And I think it's one of those things that really, like we talked about, escalates a lot, right? Because you have those key moments where you have like sort of the speeches about like being loyal to the party, or being sort of the tension that rises with Heinrich. And it's one of those films that I think is uh, I would consider it kind of a slow burn, like it takes its time to like really develop, and there's a lot of films that do that poorly, right? Like it's a slow burn throughout and like it just fizzles out, right? But I feel like this film had the ability to keep itself like not stale. Like I will say, like, again, these are not the types of films I would typically watch or enjoy, but it's a film I can appreciate for what it is and what it's trying to do.
I think, going into the film that they are going to do the Holocaust, and it's kind of a tragic story. But I do think that there are emotional components of the story that I found quite surprising. Like, in the early part of the film, Stuttgart and Kitzinger are the ones arguing most aggressively against the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And there's kind of this emotional shift in the middle of the film where you realize, especially after Stuttgart's rant, that they're fundamentally also evil. And
Yeah.
you kind of listen to the opposition, and it becomes increasingly obvious that it's not a moral problem for anyone at that meeting. It's practical or it's political.
Yeah.
The officials, like the things they bring up of why they shouldn't do the Holocaust. Genociding all the Jews, meaning they lose slave labor, lowering the morale of their soldiers when they have to do that much killing.
Yeah.
Damaging their relationship to the Catholic Church, damaging their relationship to the populations they govern, diverting valuable military resources during a war, wasting valuable equipment and bullets and the like, subverting German law and breaking up the legal system, dealing with property rights of the people who are going to be murdered, the legal system getting filled up with like divorce cases, and like also kind of this petty obsession with like the Holocaust being a vehicle for particularly the SS to take over their control and their responsibilities. And it's kind of an interesting shift where you increasingly realize that there is no resistance to it really. All of the things that people are posing, it's not a zero sum game to them. You can bribe them, you can negotiate with them. And then I think the other part is like Heydrich's monstrousness. Like he's evil at the beginning of the film, but as the film progressed, like you and the other officials, you increasingly realize just how like fundamentally evil he is. And I found both those emotional elements like really powerful and kind of they surprised me a little bit and how well they were executed.
Yeah, and that's like something we were trying to hit on when we were like taking notes and everything like that. One thing we talked about too is that sort of hidden horror in the bureaucracy of it, right? Because like this whole meeting is a bureaucratic thing to discuss, how to systematically kill off millions of people, right? And like how to do it in the most, like you said, economical, uh, uh, economic or financially savvy way, as well as like mitigating resources and doing all these things, and also taking into account, like you said, like how the populace views it, how your soldiers view it, uh, and doing it in a way that makes it as clean as possible, which is a really fucked up thing, you know.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just weird to watch how bureaucracy can be so far removed from it, right? Because you never see, like we said, you never see any of the violence, any of the sort of horrors that they're talking about. But there's this just uncomfortability with just sitting there and just being like, these people are systematically like under thinking about how to remove as much human life as possible in the most effective way bureaucratically. And I think it's one of those things you could talk about like with sort of other countries' policies that are enacted in a way that displaces fucking shit ton of people and really hurts a shit ton of people, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's one more technical component I want to talk about and have others, but
Yeah,
in
sure.
terms of themes, there's definitely this idea of the film of like bureaucracy and bureaucratic language in particular being used to hide the horror of what governments are doing. Like, um, there's all these euphemisms that they use in the meeting. The Holocaust is the final solution.
Mm-hmm.
The act of genocide is evacuation.
Yeah,
The idea of like basically taking the land that was controlled and occupied by these Jewish people, that's storage space,
yeah,
and um, throughout the meeting, those who are more overt and they refer to it in not that kind of politically correct nomenclature,
mm-hmm.
they're punished. And kind of using that terminology is kind of expected of everyone. There's a part of the film where there's kind of this SS officer who's not very bright, and he has this kind of rant which ends with like I don't really trust language, a gun is what it is. And that's that's the point of bureaucracy in that language as a system, is that it deceives people, and
Yeah.
it sort of separates people from the ramifications of their actions, and it makes it easier to hide it. I think, and Stuttgart is also an example of a character who uses bureaucracy to mask his actual, intent. The other part that I thought was really an interesting example of bureaucracy hiding things, it's not just language, it's numbers. They give all of these reports to the Nazi officials to justify the Holocaust. And there's kind of scenes where like the Nazi officials who deal with that particular sector, whether it's like labor or like the economy, they're talking amongst themselves privately and they're like, these statistics are misleading. Like they're off by hundreds of thousands, sometimes even as much as a million.
Yeah.
And, that's another example of hiding horror and bureaucracy, that you're doctoring and using all these statistics in order to not just dehumanize the human life that those numbers represent, but also as a means to sort of deceive people about your actual intentions and how feasible or rational or necessary your plan is. You know
Yeah,
what I'm
I
saying?
think I think a lot of times when we think about numbers, we don't really think about the size of them, right? Like if we think about like the toll of the Holocaust, right? 6 million Jews and like 11 million people total, I think. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to quantify that number like in your head, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult to think about that number. Like when we think of I think it's what, a million seconds is about 11 days or so or something like that, or a couple weeks or something. And then a billion seconds would be equivalent to we're talking about 32 years, I think it is. So like
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about these numbers, it's hard for a person to quantify like the actual human lives at stake, especially in this context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's just one of those films that like really showcases like how fucking dangerous bureaucracy on this scale could be, like in
Mm-hmm.
terms of just the sheer coldness of it, right? Like there's no uh, you know, there's that emotional sort of through point in the sort of grandiose speeches and everything like that. But with a character like Eichmann, it always comes back to this cold, sort of calculated, this is how it is, this is how we're
Mm-hmm.
going to do it, and this is like logistically like how it'll work, how much it'll cost, what resources will be used. And it's a horrific sort of example of what humans are unfortunately capable of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the things that I really like about this film, and I think it's pretty unparalleled, is the way it builds horror and tension.
Hmm.
And the two figures that build most of that horror is Heydrich and Eichmann, but in two different ways.
Yeah.
Uh, with Eichmann, I think it's two things. One is, his descriptions of like torture and the killings and sterilizing people and like the bare bones, and you really break down like they're going to kill millions and millions of people. And
Yeah.
you kind of realize with the rest of the Nazi officials, like the full extent of what they're really talking about. And
Yeah.
then I think the other part, which is more subtle, but I think especially kind of near the end of the film, kind of supersedes it when you get over the shock of the details of the Holocaust, is
Hmm.
how calculated it is.
Yeah.
Eichmann has planned and tested and experimented and like maximized like every step of the genocide. The type of gas, how much gas you use, how many people per the gas chambers, where the concentration camps are in relation to public transportation, how many can be killed a day in sort of a sustainable sense, like how we're going to define Jewishness in order to actually figure out like how many people there are and how we're going to get them.
Yeah.
It's so you realize how premeditated it is, and I find that's also kind of terrifying. And then
Hmm.
in terms of Heydrich, I think Heydrich is a really interesting character because he kind of represents like inevitability.
Yeah.
You and the other Nazi officials, you think that you have a choice. You think that you can discuss policy. You think you can create compromise. You think that you have a real say. And all of that is an illusion. the only person who matters in that meeting is Heydrich. Everyone else is just there to follow his orders, and there is no real ability to negotiate with Heydrich, delay the plan, or alter the plan in any way. And you can see this kind of in those individual meetings Heydrich has, where he just dominates these officials and breaks them. And you can see this in the meeting itself, where he just has complete control of the meetings. Like, he is so charismatic, he's so commanding, he is able to just shut down any ability to discuss the issue at all. And by the end of the film, I think it's one of the most powerful scenes of the film, where he forces everyone one by one to swear loyalty to him and then agree to the plan. Like, it's over. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you just feel that rising inevitability throughout the film of, like, there really is there's no opposition,
and it's wild to see, because like it's this complacency, right? Like we talked about, it's always this thing of like, um you know these people are evil, right? But they're also like complacent and willing to go along with it as long as it keeps them in power, and as long as it keeps them like in relative safety. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's one of those films where you kind of again have to like kind of reconcile with that. Another thing we like looked at too is just this madness within this hatred, right? Like, it drives all these men to the breaking point, really. And this fervent sort of anti-Semitism, as well as like just fervent hatred, really just keeps their kind of madness and sort of psychopathic tendencies going, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
totally agree. I think one of the interesting shifts in the film, and I think one of the things the film does really well, is duality,
mhm.
where, like, different characters are mirrors of each other, are different elements of the story. They're contradicted by later elements of the story when you know more. But, like, you know, the emphasis of Eichmann as a character, the thing that makes him scary, is that he seems organized and to some degree lawful and rational.
Yeah,
And then as the meeting progresses, you see how much of that lawfulness and that calculatedness, how that's not real. And really, when they break down the bare bones of it and they start questioning different elements of the Holocaust, everything is revealed to be completely insane. Like, they're abandoning their own legal system, and they're kind of breaking away from the power of the state by doing this thing. They're overruling all these experts and lawyers, and the Holocaust really destroys a lot of the separations of different structures within the government. Like, achieving the Holocaust in many ways is going to destroy, like, the institutions that build the Nazi party. And then that's not even to say, like, how damaging the Nazis understand the Holocaust will be in terms of how they're perceived by, like, the regional governments and the church and the public. And then I think the most telling example of, like, how irrational the hatred
mhm.
is there's a section where they're attempting to define who is Jewish and who's not.
Yeah,
And they start at a point where they're like, oh, like, it's a racial thing and it's also a religious thing. But kind of by the end of the meeting, they're like, if you appear Jewish at all, if you have Jewish facial features,
or if
like,
you
that's a
sound
death
Jewish,
sentence.
even they
Yeah, if
say.
you sound Jewish, if you
Yeah,
do Jewish things, if you have a Jewish personality, like, you're killed, you're done. And you really see how that, like Stukart's character, like Heydrich's character, like, the appearance of organization and groomness is not real. They're all crazy,
yeah,
and their education and their positions, and kind of like, they're talking about the economy or the military or logistics. It's all bullshit. Like, none of it really matters. None of it is really the reason they're doing anything, and they're not ultimately motivated by any rational sort of factors.
and it's not even really the reason they're there, right? Like, they're not there to talk policy. It was never really about that. It was about Heinrich telling them, like you said, this is what's going to happen, and there's nothing you can really say about it except agree or else there will be consequences for you, right?
Mhm.
Um, any sort of we're getting close to like sort of the end here, but are there like main things you want to wrap up before we go ahead and rate it and give our like final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe we give our kind of summary and our rating. I would say I think this is an amazing horror film, and I think it's really interesting, the horror bottle film. Like I don't feel like we see a lot of those. Um, I thought the dialogue was really interesting. I thought the building of suspense and horror was really masterful, and I think this film did a really good job of taking a lot of often paradoxical kind of ideas
Yeah,
and like kind of themes and matching them together in a way that felt super organic and real, but also like it built up the tension, but also really made a strong point. I think I would give it like an 8.
an eight. Yeah.
Um,
See,
yeah.
I I think I definitely agree with you on a lot of those points. I think for me, initially when I finished the film, I definitely do tend to have a bias against like historical films. But the more we've talked about it over these like 50 some odd minutes, I've kind of more come around on it just because like there's a lot of things to like about it. The acting, dialogue, things we've already mentioned are really great on it. Um, there's just this element of unsettlingness like throughout the entirety of it that just kind of like it freaks me out a lot. I actually would rate it higher. Initially, I was going to say like 7, but I think I'm bringing it all the way to an 8.5. Like it's actually a very solid piece. It moved a lot for me, and I think a lot of this conversation helped that. But yeah,
Would you
like
say there are any weaknesses to the film? Like, what would you say stops it from being like a 10?
weakness, like it's not so much a weakness, but I don't really think it's distinctive camera work wise. Like it doesn't really
Mhm.
strike me as like one of those films where a lot of times you'll see a really great film and what sets it over the edge for me is like a film that like knows it's a film, right? It's using the camera to its advantage in that way.
Mhm.
uh and I don't really think it does a lot of that. I mean, like, um I think that's one thing. Um, there's not a lot to say about like different editing techniques or stuff like that. It kind of stays grounded with that stuff, which is fine because it's, historical sort of drama. So it's not really gonna do that. But I think if you wanted to incorporate more of that horror element you were talking about, it could have probably taken some risks in that department. So I think
Mhm.
that's probably what would have helped it like cement itself in a more large scale. Um,
That's interesting.
yeah,
It's very much a shoestring kind of operation. Like anything in the film that doesn't, in a very cutthroat way, achieve its goals in terms of tension and dialogue and like emotional effect is just removed. Like
yeah,
there's not really camera work, there's not really any sort of special effects, there's not really music. Like just anything that detracts from the dialogue and the acting
yeah.
and the themes is just not in the film at all,
And I think
basically.
that's rather intentional. That's
Yeah.
like what they were going for. And I think it's one of those films where I think because it's so character focused and everything like that, you're able to like sit there and digest it a lot easier. And I think what's really interesting too is like it has a 1:30 runtime, which comparatively to modern film is actually rather short.
Hmm.
So even for a film in the 2000s, because runtime has been getting longer and longer, um, so it's one of those films that trimmed a lot of fat, I think, and just got to the meat and potatoes of it, which is
Mhm.
I think works for it oftentimes. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I have to say. Is there anything else you want to add before we call it a day here?
You know, I think we covered everything.
Okay, perfect. Well, that'll be it from us. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back as soon as we can with the next episode, but hope y'all enjoyed it. And take care and have a great rest of your day.